My parents didn't know that I'm a talented expert in economics and finance. They handed me a file and said, "Just sign it, honey, and we will own everything." But as I carefully read every single line of the fine print, I realized that everything didn't include my future. It included my ruin. My name is Melanie Reed. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last decade as a senior risk analyst for a top-tier tech firm in Seattle. In my world, a misplaced decimal point or a hidden clause can topple a billion-dollar empire. I get paid to be paranoid. I get paid to see the trap before it snaps shut. For years, I've maintained a calculated distance from my family back in the suburbs. It wasn't because I didn't love them, but because I knew their patterns. Every phone call, every spontaneous visit always had a price tag attached. I thought I had built a high enough wall to protect my life and my career. But I was wrong. I never expected that the people who gave me life would be the ones trying to legally dismantle it. When they showed up at my door with those papers, they saw a daughter they could finally exploit. They didn't realize they were facing a woman who specializes in spotting fraud for a living. In the world of finance, the greatest risk isn't found in the numbers, it's found in trusting the wrong people. If you want to learn how to protect your assets and your dignity from even the closest betrayals, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how I dismantled their trap piece by piece. The glass doors of my office building reflected the gray, overcast sky of a typical Seattle Thursday, when I saw two familiar, weary figures waiting in the lobby. I hadn't checked my personal phone for hours, buried under a mountain of quarterly risk assessments, but seeing Arthur Reed and Susan Reed standing there made my stomach do a slow, painful flip. My father looked older, his shoulders slumped under a jacket that had seen better decades, while my mother clutched her worn leather handbag like a lifebuoy in a storm. They didn't look like the architects of a financial trap. They looked like broken parents who had run out of options. "Melanie, we've been trying to reach you all week." Dad said, his voice straining with a forced gentleness that made me feel instantly defensive. He didn't wait for an answer before pulling me into a stiff, uncomfortable hug that smelled of old tobacco and desperation. Mom followed, her eyes rimmed with red, her hands trembling as she touched my arm. She told me they had spent their last few $100s on the cheapest, most inconvenient flight from Connecticut just to see me because I wasn't answering my calls. I felt a sharp pang of guilt pierce through my professional armor. I had been ignoring them, yes, but I told myself it was for my own mental clarity, not out of cruelty. We didn't talk about business or money as we walked back to my apartment. Instead, they played the roles of longing parents to perfection, commenting on how thin I looked, and asking if I was eating enough between my long shifts. Once inside my living room, the atmosphere shifted from nostalgia to tragedy. Susan began to recount the downfall of my younger brother, Julian Reed. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a young man who had been lured into the volatile world of high-risk speculative investments and had come out the other side, hollowed out by debt. The story was harrowing. Julian wasn't just broke, he was being hunted by aggressive private lenders who didn't care about legal boundaries or family ties. Mom's voice broke as she described the late-night phone calls and the shadowed figures lurking near their driveway back home. She mentioned that the family home, the one where I had carved my initials into the porch railing, was now being held as collateral for a debt Julian couldn't even explain. I sat on my designer sofa, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my success, feeling an overwhelming sense of shame. They made sure I felt every inch of the gap between my luxury and their looming ruin. It was a masterclass in emotional engineering designed to make me feel like my refusal to engage was a death sentence for my own flesh and blood. The rain began to streak against the large windows of the waterfront cafe on Friday morning, blurring the view of the Elliott Bay as I sat across from my parents. The clatter of espresso machines and the low hum of conversation felt distant, muffled by the thick tension hanging over our small marble table. Arthur didn't touch his black coffee. Instead, he reached into his weathered briefcase and pulled out a slender manila folder. He slid it toward me with a hand that seemed to tremble slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was from age or nerves. He called it a personal income guarantee, a supposedly harmless document that would serve as proof to the bank that their family had a high-earning member capable of backing Julian's debts. The bank just needs to see your stability, Melanie. Dad explained, his eyes searching mine with a desperate intensity. He claimed that this was the only way to stop the foreclosure process on the family home and give the lenders enough confidence to restructure the debt. According to him, my signature was nothing more than a formal verification of my salary, a golden stamp of approval that would keep the wolves away from their door. He kept emphasizing that I wouldn't actually have to pay a single cent. I was merely a symbol of security to pacify the creditors. The urgency in his voice was palpable, a sharp contrast to the slow, rhythmic sound of the rain outside. Susan reached across the table, her fingers cold as they brushed against my wrist, her eyes already welling with tears. She didn't talk about interest rates or legal obligations. She talked about the nights she spent sitting by my bedside when I had the flu as a child. She reminded me of the extra shifts she took at the diner just to afford my SAT prep courses, and how they had sacrificed their own retirement dreams to ensure I had a seat at the table in Seattle. "We've never asked you for anything, honey," Mom whispered, her voice cracking as a single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. "But Julian is drowning, and if we lose that house, we lose everything we've ever worked for. You're the only one who can save us." They were suffocating me with the weight of my own success, turning my professional achievements into a debt I owed them for my very existence. Dad checked his watch, mentioning that their return flight was only a few hours away, and they needed the signed documents to drop off at the lawyer's office before heading to the airport. He handed me a sleek silver pen, the kind of pen used for big deals and permanent decisions. The pressure was a physical force in the small cafe, a calculated ambush disguised as a desperate plea. They weren't asking me to read the document. They were asking me to prove I still loved them. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slow down, but the sobbing woman across from me made it nearly impossible to think straight. The humming of the city had faded into a distant rhythmic pulse by the time I retreated to my home office late Friday night. The silver pen my father had handed me sat untouched on the mahogany desk, reflecting the dim glow of my computer monitors like a silent accusation. Despite the emotional suffocated I felt in the cafe, my professional instinct refused to be silenced. I've spent my entire adult life identifying financial landmines for corporations. I wasn't about to walk blindly into one in my own living room. I pulled the manila folder from my bag, the paper feeling unnervingly heavy under the desk lamp. I didn't see a plea for help anymore. I saw a data set that needed to be audited. As I began to peel back the layers of the document, the simple income guarantee my parents described started to dissolve into something far more predatory. Within 10 minutes, I spotted the first red flag buried deep in a paragraph of dense, archaic legal jargon. It wasn't a standard verification of income. It was an unconditional and continuing guarantee agreement. In the world of high-risk lending, this is the nuclear option. The language was meticulously crafted to bypass every consumer protection law I knew. It didn't just ask me to vouch for my brother's current debt. It effectively bound my entire financial existence to his reckless whims without a sunset clause or a liability cap. The deeper I dug, the more my blood began to chill. Page 12 contained a cross-collateralization provision that made my skin crawl. By signing this, I wasn't just helping Julian Reed restructure a loan. I was giving the bank a direct legal bridge to my own assets. The document granted the creditors a blanket security interest, meaning that the moment my brother defaulted, which looking at his track record was an absolute certainty, the bank wouldn't bother chasing him. They would come for the path of least resistance, me. They would have the immediate legal right to place a lien on my Seattle condo, freeze my brokerage accounts, and execute an automatic wage garnishment from my firm before I could even file an objection. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. This wasn't a document drafted by a small-town family lawyer trying to save a local house. This was a sophisticated trap designed by a predator. It even included a waiver of notice clause, meaning the bank could seize my life savings without ever sending me a warning letter or a court summons. My parents had looked me in the eye and told me this was just a symbolic gesture, yet here it was in black and white, a legal death warrant for my career and my independence. I sat in the silence of my office, the glow of the screen illuminating the highlight marks I'd made in crimson ink. I wasn't just looking at a bad contract. I was looking at a calculated attempt by my own flesh and blood to sacrifice me to save a son who had already proven he couldn't be saved. The guilt they had tried to weaponize earlier that morning was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't going to be their victim. I was going to be their reckoning. The clinical white LED lights of my firm's conference room offered no place for shadows or lies on Saturday morning. I had invited my parents and Julian Reed here under the guise of finalizing the paperwork, but the atmosphere was far from celebratory. I sat at the head of the glass table dressed in my sharpest power suit, with 3 identical binders laid out before me. Gone was the guilt-ridden daughter who had sat paralyzed in a cafe 24 hours earlier. In her place was the senior risk analyst who had spent her night cross-referencing Washington state banking statutes with the predatory contract they had tried to force upon her. When Arthur and Susan walked in, they looked around the high-tech office with a mixture of awe and greed, likely calculating the market value of the furniture before they even sat down. I didn't offer coffee, and I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I slid the original manila folder across the table, now transformed by dozens of red-inked annotations and sticky notes, citing specific financial codes. "I'm not signing it," I said, my voice as steady as a heart rate monitor. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Julian shifting uncomfortably in his seat, unable to meet my eyes. I began to walk them through the document not as a family member, but as an auditor. I pointed out the unconditional guarantee and the cross-collateralization clauses, explaining in brutal detail how these terms would allow the bank to seize my home and garnish my wages the second my brother failed to meet his obligations. I showed them the printed excerpts from the law that proved this wasn't a standard agreement, but a legal trap designed to liquidate my life to pay for their son's failures. "How could you do this?" I asked, looking directly at my father. "You told me this was just a symbolic gesture. You lied to my face while your wife cried about SAT prep courses." For a brief second, Arthur Reed tried to maintain his tired old man persona, but as the weight of my evidence became undeniable, his mask shattered. The gentle, slumped shoulders squared up, and his eyes turned into cold, calculating stones. He slammed his fist onto the glass table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent office. "We didn't lie, Melanie. We did what was necessary." He spat, his voice trembling with a sudden visceral rage. Susan didn't cry this time. She just stared at me with a frighteningly blank expression. The dialogue quickly spiraled into a toxic display of entitlement. Arthur admitted they had reviewed the documents with their lawyer and knew exactly what the clauses meant. He didn't deny the trap. He justified it. "You have everything," he shouted, gesturing wildly at the expensive office. "You sit here in your ivory tower while your brother is drowning. It is your duty as a member of this family to sacrifice for him. What is a condo or a bank account compared to your own blood?" My mother finally spoke, her voice laced with a venom I had never heard before. She called me a cold corporate machine and accused me of being corrupted by city money because I refused to let them drown me alongside Julian. They weren't ashamed of their deception. They were only angry that I was too smart to fall for it. The betrayal was now absolute, stripped of every lingering shred of parental affection. The heavy oak doors of the conference room had barely latched shut behind my parents and Julian Reed before I was back at my terminal, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a cold, frantic energy. The venom in my father's voice still echoed in the silent office, but I didn't have time for emotional processing. Experience had taught me that when someone tries to steal your future in broad daylight, they've likely already been looting the back room under the cover of darkness. I pulled my comprehensive credit report from all three major bureaus: Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. As a risk analyst, I monitor my score religiously, but I needed a deep dive audit of every soft and hard inquiry made in the last quarter. My heart didn't just sink, it turned to stone when I saw the entry. 3 weeks ago, on the exact day Arthur and Susan began their barrage of desperate phone calls, a hard inquiry had been triggered for a high-interest personal loan at a boutique credit union I never used. The application had been submitted online using my full name, social security number, and even a forged digital signature. They hadn't just come to Seattle to ask for a signature, they had already attempted to steal my identity while I was still deciding whether or not to answer their calls. They had used my life as a pawn in their game long before they ever stepped into my lobby. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I picked up the office phone and called the Seattle Police Department to file a formal identity theft report, providing them with the timestamps and the IP address logs I managed to trace through my firm's security portal. Next, I contacted the credit bureaus to place a permanent security freeze on my accounts, ensuring that no one, not even me, could open a line of credit without a secondary high-level verification process. The guilt they had tried to cultivate in me was dead. In its place was a singular, icy focus on self-preservation. I was no longer a daughter. I was a complainant in a criminal investigation. My final call was the most satisfying. I dialed the private line of Arthur Miller, the family lawyer back in Connecticut who had drafted the predatory documents. When he answered, his voice was smooth and condescending until I started speaking. I didn't yell. I spoke with the clinical precision of a woman who knew exactly which bar association rules he had violated. I told him I had already filed a police report and that my next call would be to the state bar to initiate a formal grievance for his role in facilitating financial exploitation and identity fraud. I told him that if he didn't immediately rescind every document involving my name and provide a notarized affidavit admitting to the lack of my consent, I would ensure his law license was revoked before the month was out. The silence on the other end of the line was the most honest thing I had heard from anyone in my family for years. I hung up before he could apologize, knowing that the legal gears I had set in motion were now irreversible. I had spent a decade protecting corporations from bad actors, but this was the first time I had ever protected myself. 2 weeks had passed since the storm in my office, and the dust was finally settling over the wreckage of my family's deceit. The consequences of their actions arrived not as a sudden lightning bolt of my making, but as the inevitable gravity of their own financial collapse. Because I had refused to sign that predatory guarantee, the bank back in Connecticut had no reason to delay the inevitable. Without my income to secure the restructuring, the foreclosure on the family home moved forward with brutal efficiency. I heard through the grapevine that Julian Reed was facing a barrage of civil lawsuits from the private lenders he had tried to outrun. My parents were forced to pack up decades of memories into cardboard boxes and move into a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town. They had tried to gamble with my life to save their pride, and in the end, the house always wins. I didn't feel a surge of triumph when I heard the news, nor did I feel the hollow satisfaction of revenge. I simply felt light, as if a crushing weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I spent my Saturday morning writing one final certified letter to Arthur and Susan. I didn't use it to scream or to shame them. I used it to set a permanent boundary. I told them that while I would always carry the memory of the parents who raised me, I could no longer associate with the predators they had become. I made it clear that any further attempt to contact me or exploit my identity would be met with immediate legal action. I told them I loved them, but I loved my own safety and dignity more. I wasn't just closing a bank account, I was closing a chapter of my life that had been defined by a toxic sense of obligation. There is a profound, often painful lesson in this journey that transcends the numbers on a balance sheet. In the world of tech and finance, we talk about risk management as a professional skill, but we rarely discuss it as a survival tool for our personal lives. We are taught that family is an unconditional bond, a safety net that should never break. But the truth is that love should never cost you your security, and blood should never be a license for exploitation. Being a good daughter doesn't mean allowing yourself to be a sacrificial lamb for someone else's irresponsibility. Setting a hard financial boundary isn't an act of cruelty, it is an act of self-respect. If you don't define your own limits, the world, and sometimes even the people you love most, will happily define them for you until there is nothing left. I stood by my window today, looking out over the Seattle skyline, as a new project took shape on my monitors. I've started a volunteer initiative at the local community center teaching young professionals how to spot the early warning signs of financial coercion within their own families. I'm learning to be alone without being lonely, finding a new kind of peace in the silence of my home. My credit score is frozen, my locks have been changed, and my future is once again entirely my own. I spent years analyzing the risks of others, but the most important audit I ever performed was on my own life. I am Melanie Reed, 32 years old, and I am finally truly free.